Welcome to another lesson on the book of Leviticus. Today we'll be in chapter 17. I'm calling this Holiness and Blood. I'll explain that to you in a moment. You're familiar with Leviticus. We've got a lot of talking about blood to do, so we'll dive into that. Before I do that, I don't know if any of you have ever been parents, or maybe you've been a boss, had employees, and you tell your kids or your employees to do something, and you explain what to do, how to do it, and then they ask the one question: why? It's a good question. Why am I supposed to clean up my room now as opposed to later? Why am I supposed to wear this? Why am I supposed to push that button at that time? Why? Well, I think that where we are here in Leviticus, we start to ask the question, why for all of this? Why the sacrifices? Why the Day of Atonement? Well, we know in one sense the answer to that, because the people needed to be cleansed. We know that the tabernacle needed to be cleansed, but even then, why? Why did they need to be cleansed? We'll see here in chapter 17 through 27 a number of laws given. And you could ask the question, why? Why are those laws given? So in chapter 17 through 27, the rest of the book, we'll start to get into answering these why questions. I want you to see kind of a preview of these chapters before I dive more specifically into chapter 17 today. First, know that the people have learned the sacrificial system. That's what we've been looking at. Chapters 1 through 15, they learned about the different types of sacrifices. We learned what the priests are supposed to do. We've learned what happens when there's actually sin and death in the tent, what needs to happen after that. So we've learned about the sacrificial system. And then the Day of Atonement provides purification for the people and the tabernacle. So because there was death in the tabernacle, there needed to be a re-cleansing, if you were, a spring cleaning, so to speak. And so we came to chapter 16 and we learned about the Day of Atonement, providing that cleansing for not only the people, but also the tabernacle and all of the elements in the tabernacle. The people are reminded that they have access to God. So they have access to God, and they would remember that on the Day of Atonement. Everything is clean in our midst. We are right before Him. We have access to Him. We can meet with Him to offer sacrifices. We can come Sabbath after Sabbath. We are right with God. They would remember that. However, and this is important, the goal of Leviticus is that people would have fellowship with God. Not just that they'd be right before Him. Not just that they'd be clean. Not just that they'd be without sin, but that they would be those things so that they can have fellowship with Him. Remember, I've told you a number of times throughout our study in Leviticus that you can think a lot about the Garden of Eden and the fellowship that Adam and Eve had with God in that garden. Then they sinned, they were expelled from the garden, and God here now in the wilderness is making this tent complex so that the people can rightly approach Him. But then you ask the question, but why? Why should they rightly approach Him and be in His presence? Well, it's so that they can have fellowship with Him. They can enjoy Him. They can enjoy being in a right relationship with God, their Creator. So the whole goal of this is fellowship and joy and intimacy with God. We don't want to miss that. Some other parts, some other elements of the preview of these coming chapters, we're going to look at laws regarding holiness. So the people have a sacrificial system. There's a way to God. There's a spring cleaning, if you will, in the Day of Atonement. And then there are these laws on holiness that fill up chapters 17 through 27. Now, I want you to see this. Michael Morales, an author who's been very helpful to me in the study of Leviticus, talks about the purpose for those laws. Why the laws on holiness? And listen to what he says. The holiness legislation, or as some call it, the holiness code. The holiness legislation is not merely a practical code of conduct as much as a manifesto of Israel's identity as those who belong to Yahweh. And then he quotes Leviticus 20:26, "And you shall be holy to me, for I, Yahweh, am holy, and have separated you from the peoples that you should belong to me." Now, let me connect this to even our day and age. A lot of people think that this book, the Bible, is simply a set of rules. Do this, don't do that. A lot of people have a basic understanding of the Ten Commandments. And again, they think of the Bible as just kind of a rule book. It's not that. We know that. We know that this book is God's revelation to us that he gives us because he desires a relationship with us. God desires a relationship with his people. The holiness code, or the holiness legislation, if you will, is how to dwell with a holy God. Because he's holy, we must be holy, but that's not the end of the story. The end of the story is, and we get to be with him. Not just be like him, but we get to be with him and enjoy his fellowship. That's the idea. That's why Genesis 1 and 2 starts off with God creating this world and creating man and woman, and they enjoy this fellowship with God. Then we know about sin in the rest of the Bible, the way back to God through Christ. And then how does the Bible end? It talks about God dwelling again with his people. That's the goal. So the goal is not just laws for law's sake. The goal is a code of holiness for fellowship with God. And that's so important to understand, not just for these people here in the wilderness in the time of Moses. It's important for us to understand as well. The goal is to be in God's presence, to be holy, and to enjoy fellowship with him. That's the why. That's the why there are holiness codes. That's the why there are sacrifices. That's the why. And that's really important. Being in the presence of God, here's another thought. Being in the presence of God, as you come the right way to him, being in the presence of God leads to holiness. And this is kind of that statement right there that I just stated that's on the screen. That statement could really be the outline to Leviticus. Being in the presence of God. Well, how do I get in the presence of God? How do I get in the presence of God without dying? See chapters 1 through 16. Now that I'm in the presence of God and know him, and he's acceptable to me, and he's powerful and strong, and he's holy and amazing, and he's merciful, he allows me to be here. Now, what does that lead to? That leads to me being holy. So being in the presence of God should lead to holiness. And again, we see that in the New Testament as well. 2 Corinthians 3 talks about seeing him and understanding him. That's the idea. And we go from one level of glory to the next. We advance. There's a reason the Bible says that when we see him, we'll be like him. So seeing more of him, knowing more of him, being more aware of him, being in his presence leads to holiness. And that's what we're going to start to see in chapters 17 through 27. Now, let's look specifically at chapter 17. Turn there if you're not already there. And we're going to see in chapter 17 a lot of talk about sacrifice and blood. And again, I'm not going to walk through every verse, but let me start by reading verses 1 through 9. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and his sons and to all the people of Israel, and say to them, This is the thing that the Lord has commanded. If anyone of the house of Israel kills an ox or a lamb or a goat in the camp, or kills it outside the camp, and does not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to offer it as a gift to the Lord in front of the tabernacle of the Lord, blood guilt shall be imputed to that man. He has shed blood, and that man shall be cut off from among his people. This is to the end that the people of Israel may bring their sacrifices that they sacrifice in the open field, that they may bring them to the Lord, to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and sacrifice them as sacrifices of peace offerings to the Lord. And the priest shall throw the blood on the altar of the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting, and burn the fat for a pleasing aroma to the Lord. So they shall no more sacrifice their sacrifices to goat demons, after whom they whore. This shall be a statute forever for them throughout their generations. And you shall say to them, Any one of the house of Israel, or of the strangers who sojourn among them, who offers a burnt offering or sacrifice, and does not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to offer it to the Lord, that man shall be cut off from his people. So let's talk about a few things that we see in those first 9 verses. First, chapter 7. There's language about sacrifice and offering it at the tabernacle or the tent of meeting. That's kind of familiar to us so far. But then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we hear about goat demons. What in the world are goat demons? And I touched on this a little bit last week in the study on Leviticus 16, Day of Atonement. But recognize this. Israel was tempted to be influenced by the other peoples around them, the other nations around them. Other nations offered sacrifices to a number of other gods. Now, the Bible understands and God teaches that those other gods can be thought of as demons. So the people around the nation would offer sacrifices to different gods. One of these gods might have looked like a goat. And it might have had to do with the idea of fertility. We don't know for sure, but there could be this idea that the other nations would offer blood sacrifices. They'd kill an animal, or maybe even a person, maybe even a child, and they'd offer this sacrifice to this god that maybe looked like a goat, and it would be for the sake of fertility or life. Maybe it was to get their grain to grow or to have children, whatever it might be. They would offer sacrifices to other gods. Well, don't think that the people of Israel weren't tempted to do the same thing just to kind of hedge their bets to make sure that they were taken care of. They might have even seen, because demons are powerful, they might have even seen sacrifices take place, and then all of a sudden rain come. So they can be influenced by their nations, as we can be. We can be influenced by the world as well. So God is saying sacrifices are for me. Sacrifices are not to be given to any other god. And we know, again, because of already Israel's short history from the time of going from Egypt into the wilderness, we know that they were influenced to offer sacrifices like the other nations did. They built a golden calf just a little bit earlier and offered sacrifices to that calf. So God is saying these sacrifices are not to be given to the goat demons. And evidently, in the language here, the Israelites had done that before. Listen to what verse 7 said. So they shall no more sacrifice their sacrifices to goat demons, after whom they whore. This is spiritual adultery. So evidently the people of Israel had done this before. So what Yahweh is doing here is he's saying, listen, when you make a sacrifice, it's no longer to be done out just anywhere. Because when a sacrifice was done somewhere else, it was to a different god or even to a demon. These sacrifices need to be given in the tabernacle. And who dwells in the tabernacle? Yahweh does. So this is a way of God taking the sacrifices for himself. Now, some people think that this just speaks to hunting or killing of any animal. And that's not really what the text is going after. It talks about killing, but it uses the word for sacrifice. So this isn't just if you kill an animal, 2 miles outside of the tabernacle for food for your family, that you've got to drag it 2 miles to the tent and offer it as a sacrifice. It's not talking about that. It's talking about when you sacrifice, do a sacrifice, you don't do it out there. You do it in here, because it's not for the demon who's out there. It's for the God who's in here, Yahweh. So that's what this is talking about in chapter 17. Now notice in verse 9, and it's also earlier in the chapter, but verse 9 ends this way. This person who offers the burnt offering or sacrifice and does not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting, so they've offered it somewhere else, and the idea is they've probably offered it to another god. They don't bring it to the tent of meeting to offer it to the Lord. That man shall be cut off from his people. Now this is really important. Remember, as I was going through the sacrifices early on in Leviticus 1 through 5, I talked a lot about the fact that these sacrifices were for unintentional sins. Maybe a sin that you did that you didn't intend to do, and maybe even a sin that you did that later on in your life, or days later, weeks later, you realized, I shouldn't have done that. And so you offer these sacrifices. And I told you that this wasn't about, these sacrifices weren't about intentional sins, because they're not. The sacrificial system is largely for unintentional sins. So you ask the question, what about intentional sins? What about adultery? What about offering a sacrifice to another god or a demon and not to Yahweh? What happens then? What sacrifice do we offer? Well, the answer to that question is basically no sacrifice. The person is to be cut off from his people. Now, what did it mean to be cut off from your people? Did it mean that you go sit in the corner for a few weeks? No, it means that you're literally cut off from your people. You're sent out of the community. You're actually not allowed to live there anymore. You're, in a sense, disowned. You're done. You're gone. You offer sacrifices to another god, you're gone. And the idea of being cut off had the idea of maybe premature death behind it, because you're no longer in the protected community, in the protected people of God. It was a kind of a way to say, you're on your own, you're given over to the other demons, the other gods out there. God will punish you accordingly, but you're no longer protected by this community. So it was very severe. It was a severe punishment, not it wasn't overly severe, it was appropriately severe of God to cut off these people. So that's what would happen when you sinned in these ways. We'll hear as we go through Leviticus 17 through 27 about if you violate this law, you're going to be cut off. It doesn't say if you violate this law, do this sacrifice. That's important to understand. The sacrifices were largely for those unintentional sins. These serious sins of worshiping another god or sacrificing to a demon or committing adultery or a number of other things, you were either killed on the spot, stoned, or you were cut off from your people. So that's important to understand. Now, verses 10 through 16 show us that we've kind of gone through verses 1 through 9. 10 through 16, 10 through the end of the chapter, show us, they start talking about blood. All right, so Moses is writing about blood, Yahweh's talking about blood, and what do we learn from these verses? Well, blood could not be consumed. Blood was not allowed to be digested, taken in. Why is that? Well, think about what blood represented. Blood represented life. So the life of the flesh is in the blood. When you think blood, you think life. Now, who gives life? It's not some foreign god. It's not some foreign deity. Who gives life? Yahweh, the creator of the world, the life giver. God gives life. God gives blood. So when someone would have a cut or something like that, and there would be bleeding, they would link that to life. They knew in their kind of pre-scientific day, they knew it's not good to lose blood. We need blood to live. So blood means life, and life means blood. So blood is not to be consumed. It's as if you're taking in another life, or it might even think of even murder there. So God keeps blood from being consumed by the people because you don't take life, Yahweh gives life. So blood is key in Leviticus, and blood is also linked to sacrifice. Now, you've seen this already in Leviticus. You'll see this played out in the rest of the scriptures. We understand, especially when we understand what Christ came to do, that he wasn't just a good example for us to follow, and then we follow him and we're right with God. No, he had to die for us. He had to be a sacrifice for us. There needed to be a death for sin. So Christ, what did he do according to Hebrews 12:24? He shed his blood, or his blood was sprinkled, shed, open. The blood was out of his veins and spilled. That's a picture of death. So it's not just that Christ had blood. He had blood when he was alive, but he had to shed it for us, to sprinkle it for us. It had to be outside of his body, if you will. So this is what happens in the book of Leviticus. You see these sacrifices, and they're signify, or the way that you think about their death is that they've shed their blood. So what we have here is blood is shed when something dies. It's a sacrifice. It's a substitute. So blood is precious. You don't just eat blood. So now we have these laws against eating blood or taking in blood, consuming blood. Blood is not to be consumed. When you would offer a sacrifice and then eat the animal, you would have to first drain the blood. You're not to consume the blood. Now, in verse 15, it's interesting that there's a provision here. If you come across an animal that maybe was killed by another animal, if you come across that, you can eat that. So you didn't get to drain the blood so much, but you can eat that. But you've got to go through a process of cleansing yourself. So remember, they didn't just go down to the local grocery store when they were hungry. They needed to have grain grow. They needed to have animals to eat. So they were more desperate than for their food than we are, so to speak. So if they saw an animal laying there that was just maybe freshly killed by another animal, they would want to eat that. But maybe they weren't in a place to drain the blood, or what do I do here? There was a way to do that, and you had to go through this process of being clean. So God's still gracious to say you can eat that animal, and the blood at this point, because the animal's maybe been sitting there for a few hours, may have been dried up a little bit. And you're thinking, I can't get the dry blood off of that animal, out of that animal, but we're hungry. We need to eat that. God graciously provided them a way to eat that animal, but they needed to be clean. Verse 15, and every person who eats what dies of itself or what is torn by beasts, whether he is a native or a sojourner, shall wash his clothes and bathe himself in water and be unclean until the evening. Then he shall be clean. But if he does not wash them or bathe his flesh, he shall bear his iniquity or bear his sin. So God's even been gracious here. When there's an animal there and you can't drain the blood because it's dried up, you can still eat the animal, but you've got to wash in this way. And remember that you're not clean before the Lord, but you need to be clean before the Lord. So that's what that's talking about at the end of chapter 17. So now, some takeaways here. All life is valuable because it's been given by God. And we'll see this played out in Leviticus. A lot of the holiness code especially starting in chapters 18 and then going through 27, talks about how to treat other people. And the idea is that when God creates a people, whether they're an Amorite or a Hittite or an Italian or a Mexican or an American, when he creates a person, he breathes life into that person. He gives them blood, he gives them life, he gives them oxygen, he gives them the things that they need. And so we'll see that played out here more so. But this idea of blood that we've seen in chapter 17 starts to remind us of this. Okay, life is precious. Another takeaway. Worship or spirituality is spiritual adultery unless it's aimed at the true and living God. So again, the people of Israel, they were offering just maybe days before this, they were offering a sacrifice to a God that they had molded by their own hands. They offered sacrifices to a golden calf. And they thought they were worshiping. They thought it was okay. We learn later when Moses comes down and Yahweh enacts his judgment that was not okay. But think about it even today. People say things like, I'm a spiritual person. Well, that doesn't matter. In fact, that's worse than saying I'm not a spiritual person. The reality is everyone's a spiritual person. But if you're saying I'm spiritual, but I don't worship the true and living God through his son, Jesus Christ, that's adultery. That's spiritual harlotry. And the Bible over and over links those two things. So worshiping another God or not worshiping Yahweh the right way is adultery. You're cheating on God, so to speak. The prophet Jeremiah will talk a lot about that. So worship or spirituality is spiritual adultery unless it's aimed at the true and living God. Now that's not popular in today's day and age. Today, someone walks out down the street and they say, I'm a spiritual person, and people applaud them. Well, that's not the case biblically. You had to worship the one true and living God. And it was here, in this time, the God of the people of Israel. Now remember, the people of Israel, according to Exodus 19, were supposed to be a kingdom of priests. They were supposed to bring the knowledge of Yahweh to the nations, just like we are to do. So we're not calling on people just to worship. We're calling on people to worship the one true and living God. Finally, Jesus did not come to be simply an example. Jesus came to shed his blood. Now think about that. This study, or the study of Scripture, the study of Christianity, isn't so that you would just be a better person. You look at Jesus and realize, oh, look how he cared for the poor. Oh, look what he did here with the money. Look what he did here in this area. And then I'm going to pattern my life after that. First, you need to have Jesus' death credited to you, because you deserve to die. I deserve to die. We need Jesus' death credited to us. We need his new life to be credited to us. So we needed a sacrifice. We need a sacrifice. And that sacrifice is the one that heaven sent, the perfect sacrifice, to shed his blood. God the Father did not send God the Son to give us a lesson in morality. He sent his Son to be our sacrifice first, and then to teach us how to be like God through him. So that's so important. So we don't just look to Jesus as an example. We do that, but we look to him as our example because we're already right with him because of his death previous to that. So for us, let's worship the Lord today for dying for us, for shedding his blood for us. Again, he didn't just come to teach us. He came to die for us. I'll end by reading this from the book of Revelation, chapter 5. Worthy are you, speaking to Jesus, singing to Jesus, worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals, because you were slain, and by your, there's the word, by your blood, you ransom people for God. By your death, you ransom people for God. By you being executed, having your blood spilt, you ransom people for God. You took people out of the captivity to sin, and you brought them to God. from every tribe and language and people and nation. And isn't this a great line in light of the book of Leviticus? God is speaking to one nation, his people, Israel, and he's giving them a way to be right with him. And we know that that's a picture of how he allows us to be right with him through his son, Jesus Christ. So a sacrificial system, you go through the system to be right with me. You go through the sacrifice of Christ to be right with me. And it's not just meant for Israel. It's meant to be for people from every tribe and language and people and nation. God is a gracious God to the entire world, and he's made a way for people to be right through him through death, through the death of his own beloved son. So I hope that you can praise the Lord for even the ideas that start in Leviticus 17 and then continue on throughout the rest of Scripture. Next week, Lord willing, we'll get to chapters 18 through 20 and see what the Lord is telling us there. Have a great week.